Thank you so much for coming this evening. As we were preparing for tonight, our phones have been going off the hook with calls coming in saying, I'm at a shadi, going to a funeral, stopping at a fundraiser, and then we'll stop here, then I have to go to another event. So it speaks of the vibrancy and the events that are happening in our community, and we're happy that you chose to join us this evening for this event. We've been really excited about tonight as we've been planning for the past several months. And we're also very happy to be joined by many guests that have flown in from outside town for a training workshop that we'll be having tomorrow. So if I could kindly ask the guests that have come in from out of town to please stand up and be recognized. We want to give you a warm Michigan welcome for coming in. Thank you. I hope you have a chance to meet and talk with them this evening as the evening proceeds. But let's switch to a lot of the excitement about this evening, about our keynote speaker, Professor Marshall Ganz. Some people know Marshall as a labor organizer, as a political strategist, someone who is credited with developing the grassroots organizing and trading model for Barack Obama's successful 2008 campaign. And some people know him as a senior lecturer at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard on public policy, or someone who is writing, teaching, and researching on leadership and organization and strategy on social movements. But I know Marshall to do that and more. I know Marshall as an expert who actually lives the theory and who practices what he teaches. I took his organizing course many years ago, and we were being trained on how to mobilize people, create agency, and we had to pick an actual project that semester. So I went to him and I said, I want to work on a project that helps with the protection of employees working at Apple plants in China. And as an Apple user, I feel that we need to focus on that issue and then look at Foxconn and really work in that area and organize people. And so Marshall listened to that and very carefully nodded throughout the story and said, that's really, really important. That's an important project. And whatever you do here on campus has a magnifying and a multiplying effect. So I think it's good. But let me ask you one question. Who's going to organize the Muslim community? And it was that question that pushed me back to go back and focus on the community. And that's what Marshall does. He remembered my story. He challenged me to go back and focus on an issue, on a community, and on an issue that he knew connected with my own personal narrative. Marshall is someone that invests in you, someone who remembers details, who listens, who understands global and local issues. And he helps link individuals. He's connected me with organizers who are doing groundbreaking work not only in the US, but working on social movements in Egypt, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and the list goes on. Marshall is someone who is trying to create agency and develop leadership across the country and globally. And since grad school, I've worked with Marshall to coach Muslim leaders using public narrative. And every time we finish a session, we walk away more challenged, inspired, and committed to the future. And a future that we will help create ourselves. We're so lucky and blessed to have him join us today to share some insights and on the work that we are doing and this important topic of organizing people, power, and change in the American Muslim community. So please join me in welcoming Sheikh Marshall Ganz.
Sheikh, that's new. A promotion. Thank you. Thank you, Farhan. One of the challenging things about Farhan's introductions are that you have to live up to them. And so it creates this very challenging, no, but thank you. And thanks, yeah, it's true, isn't it? Yeah. And thank you to the ISPU board and staff, and to the leadership of the Unity Center community. Visiting this mosque, it feels as if one is entering the heart of the community. And I congratulate you on your wonderful work. and thank you for the opportunity to be here, to be part of it. To all, I thank you for the opportunity to share this evening with you, to work with you, to learn with you, and most important, to hope with you. Hope is one of the key elements that the Protestant theologian Walter Brueggemann identifies as driving what he calls the prophetic imagination. And by the prophetic imagination, he means the capacity to imagine change, to imagine transformation. The other element, he says, is criticality, a clear view of the world's hurt, of its limits, of its pain, of its need for change, which, when coupled with hope, a sense of the world's promise and its possibilities, transforms into the capacity to inspire change. And your community, your organization, your leadership is located at this transformational intersection right now. Transformational intersection. Immigration. Someone once said, America doesn't have revolutions, it has immigration. The struggles of new arrivals and their children to make their way here has been a key driver in change in labor, education, politics, and enterprise as each wave struggles to open up opportunities for themselves and their families, and in that way open up greater opportunities for all of us. Faith, ever since its founding of this country, faith has been a major source of the moral energy and resources to create change and to inspire change. On the one hand, negotiations between the New England Puritans and the Virginia Episcopalians, neither of one could make claims on a state church, led to the separation of church and state that created the conditions for the religious pluralism that has been such an important part of our tradition. At the same time, the great social movements of the 19th and 20th century, from the movement for abolition and temperance to the movements for civil rights, have been rooted in the rich moral resources of our faith traditions that have driven partisan, political, and policy change in this country. Immigration, faith, and generation. There's a generational shift going on here, a generational change. And one of the things about new generations coming of age is they come of age with a critical eye on the world they find. Brueggemann's criticality, but almost of necessity, hopeful hearts, his hope. And so generation change is yet another source of transformational energy. So I'm very grateful for the opportunity to have this time with you at this moment and to work with you in this workshop tomorrow. And that's what I want to say a few words about this evening, is about this opportunity for leadership, the necessity for struggle, and the promise that this holds for all of us. The approach that I take to leadership is rooted in three questions posed by a first-century Jerusalem scholar, Rabbi Hillel. And when he was asked, how do I consider what am I to do in the world, he responded with three questions to ask yourself. And the first question, he said, is ask yourself, if I am not for myself, who will be for me? Now, it's not a selfish question. It's a self-regarding question. It says that if you presume to lead, then you better be clear about why and what you bring to it and what you expect from it and what your resources are for it. But then the second question, he says, to ask yourself is, if I am for myself alone, what am I? Because to be a who and not a what is to recognize that we exist in relationship with others in this world. We are relational creatures, and our capacity to realize our objectives is inextricably bound up with the capacity of others to realize theirs. And finally, he says, ask yourself, if not now, when? Which isn't advice to jump off a bridge. It is recognition of the fact that rarely can we learn how to achieve what we want to achieve until we actually begin to do it. That understanding doesn't precede action, it flows from action. And so the challenge is to get into action when we don't have all the answers, when things are uncertain, and to find the courage to act with the confidence that we can learn and grow in the course of acting. Now, for me, that's a lot of what leadership is all about, is the intersection of those three elements of self, other, and action, and how they interact with each other. Now, organizing is a particular form of leadership that begins by asking not what is the problem, but who are my people? A dramatic moment. This is a very, thank you. And the question an organizer asks, like I say, is not what is the problem, but who are my people? And what is the problems or the challenges they face from their experience and their point of view? And most importantly, how can I work with them to enable them to use their resources in new ways to solve those problems? So it's looking at a community not as a set of clients dependent on one for good services. The word client actually comes from Latin inclinare, to lean upon. Not as a set of customers to be sold products, but rather as people who can come together to form a constituency. And constituency also comes from the Latin two words, constare, which means to stand together. In other words, to enable a community to come together, stand together, decide together, act together, and win together. And that's what the mission of organizing is all about. And, it's not like it's something brand new or was just invented or, came up. I mean, it's certainly as old as the Exodus story. It's as old as the day the Greeks decided they didn't need kings. It's as old as some people in Ireland who had a landlord, a British landlord, who wouldn't improve their conditions, and they refused to give him his share of the produce until he fixed things, which he eventually did, and his name happened to be Captain Boycott, which is where we get the boycott. People have been resourceful in finding ways to combine their resources to advance their interests for a long, long time. And for this country, it's been foundational. It's been foundational. If you go to those New England townships, the three things you always saw at the beginning of a New England township was a meeting house, a church, and a commons. All three things. It's what de Tocqueville wrote about with a French aristocrat who came to look at democracy in America, was so worried about radical individualism. And what he observed was the rich associational life at that time in this country, bringing people together to do the work of discover common interests and act on common concerns. That he wrote, in a democracy, he said, knowledge of how to combine is the mother of all forms of knowledge. That democracy is not just about the protection of individual liberties, it's about the creation of effective collective capacity, the capacity of communities to work together. So that's the organizing piece. Now, my introduction to this came in 1964 when I was a junior at Harvard College. And I have to say, those pictures, I was wondering who that guy was. Oh, a little different. Well, we changed. I guess wisdom is supposed to be the compensation for the change, so we hope so. I don't know. Sometimes maybe not. But I was a junior at Harvard College, and I volunteered for the Mississippi Summer Project, which took me to Mississippi to work with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in the campaigns then to break down the barriers to racial segregation, particularly with respect to voting and voting rights in that state, which was sort of the hardcore of resistance. Many people may have seen the Selma movie. Well, that was sort of part of that whole struggle. And the reason as I reflect on it, the reason I left school, and it was just going to be for a summer originally, I think there were three reasons. Although I grew up in Bakersfield, California, where my father was a rabbi, my mother a teacher, we'd lived in Germany for 3 years after the Second World War when, oh, okay, thank you. This is good. Our timekeeper, this is very important. I have a hard stop, thank you. We'd lived in Germany for 3 years after the Second World War when my father was a chaplain in the American Army. And his work was mostly with Holocaust survivors, and as a child, I met people whose lives had been shattered by that horror. My 5th birthday party was actually in a camp. They were called DP camps, displaced person camps of all children, where my mother thought I should give gifts rather than receive them. But my parents interpreted the Holocaust to me as not being just about anti-Semitism, but about racism. and that racism kills. Very simple, not a complex political, ideological question. Racism kills, and the civil rights movement was challenging the institutionalized racism that sadly has been a part of our history as a country since its founding. As a rabbi's son, I had to go to all the stuff, all the services, which was fine, except you were also supposed to be perfect, which was a different set of issues that I won't get into. But I loved the Passover meal, the Passover Seder, the reenactment of that story, of that journey from slavery to freedom with food, which was kind of nice. But there was a part where they pointed to the children and they said, "You were slaves in Egypt." And I said, "I've never been a slave. I've never been to Egypt." "What do you mean?" It took me a while to figure out what it meant was that story is not the property of one people or one time or one place, but it's told generation after generation. You got to kind of figure where you are in it. Are you with those guys with the chariots chasing those people, or are you with those people trying to find a land of promise? And the civil rights movement spoke the language, same language of the Exodus. And it was a movement of young people, my peers. Dr. King was 25 when he led the Montgomery bus boycott. It was people 18, 19, 20 years old. So I volunteered for the summer project, got to Mississippi, and that's really when my political education began, with all due respect to Harvard. Because it was very clear that in every measure of inequality, whites were here and blacks were here: housing, healthcare, education, you name it. But it was also clear that it was when I learned the difference between charity and justice, that bringing a few medical supplies or some books wouldn't really do very much. That the real question was not what's wrong, but why is it wrong? And that's the justice question. Why is it wrong? And when you start to ask those questions, why is it this way, then that's when you get into trouble. Because that's when you discover that maybe one reason it's the way it is because some people want it that way. They're benefiting from it, even though other people are losing. And once you realize that, then you realize you got a problem. You got a problem of power. And how do you fix that? And of course, civil rights movement recognized that it had that problem. African Americans had no right to vote, not protected by the legal protections of labor laws for other workers that didn't cover agricultural workers. And I'd never had the experience of going up to somebody twice my age who would stand up, call me Mr., introduce himself with his first name, not look me in the eye and offer me his chair because he was black and I was white, and that went on thousands of times a day across the South. So you put together the cultural and the economic and the political powerlessness, and you begin to understand why there was a problem. So we understood when there's inequality, you got to look at the power question. But then what do you do about it? Well, some people thought, well, you go to the powerful people. You say, "Hi, powerful people, can you fix this?" Go to Washington, D.C. And what you would get is, well, we need more documentation. We need more research. Testify before our committee. It became very clear that unless the people with the problem also found a way to solve the problem, it would never get solved. But they don't have any power. So what do you do about that? Well, we understood there's a difference between resources and power. And the question communities and organizers had to face was, how do we use the resources of a community to turn it into a source of power? And the lesson that we all learned about how to do that occurred 10 years before the Selma movie in Montgomery, Alabama, with the Montgomery bus boycott. And I want to take a moment on that because it illustrates a critical point about sources of power. You know, in 1954, the Supreme Court said segregation was unconstitutional in the United States. We're still working on the desegregation of schools. 1955, the community in Montgomery said, maybe we can do something about buses, because the way the buses worked was it was blacks in the back, whites in the front, armed deputized bus driver. If you were a black person, you walked past the armed deputized bus driver, all the rows of white people, then you got a seat. And if a white person wanted the seat, you got up and gave it to him. Twice a day, going to work, come home from work, think about what that does to your dignity, your self-respect. A lot of anger in that community. I thought maybe we could do something about this because of the court ruling, so let's file a lawsuit. So we need a good plaintiff, and so they found a woman named Rosa Parks, who was not just a lady who one day got tired. She was secretary of the NAACP chapter there. She was trained in organizing, and she was the chosen plaintiff. So they arrested Rosa Parks. But then this is good program. I'm going to have to talk faster. I'm going to use shorter words. No. But when they arrested Rosa Parks and took her to jail, the women's committee at the state college there, led by a woman named Joanne Robinson, said, we can't let her go to jail by herself. We got to show some solidarity. So they went to Dr. King's and the others and said, look, let's try to get the whole community to stay off the buses one day. And if that, then we'll show some solidarity. So they agreed. They leafleted all the churches, which were central to this. And so that next Monday morning, there's a great story of Dr. King getting up early, watching the buses go by to see if there were any black faces, and there wasn't a single one. And at that moment, that community looked at itself differently, and it said, wow, look what we just did. Because one of the problems of powerlessness is that we don't trust each other. We don't have faith in each other. We don't believe we can actually work together. And that transformed that community's idea of itself. But it did more than that. Because that night they decided not just one day, they were going to stay off those buses until they finally changed their policy. And what they discovered was a critical lesson about power. They thought you had to look up for power to the courts, to Washington. What they discovered was that they had resources that could become a source of power, every single person in that community. What resource am I talking about? What resource am I talking about? What do they all have? Look down. What do you see when you look down? Feet. How about that? Everybody in that community had feet. And if they used their feet to walk to work instead of getting on that bus, guess what? Turned out the bus company was more dependent on them collectively than any of them were on the bus company. It took a year, but they won. And that transformation of individual resource into collective power, that's at the heart of what organizing is all about, is discovering the resources that ordinary people have and how those resources can be transformed into sources of power to create change, whether it's through the vote or whether it's through your feet or whether it's through in the United Farm Workers, we did a whole thing with boycotting grapes. The American colonists did it by not drinking tea. There are many creative ways to do this. Now, that became very exciting to me, and it was also clear that it took leadership to do this, like Dr. King, like Rosa Parks and others. And so what I learned was that there was this way to develop leadership, build community around leadership, build power from community, and that was a way to create change in this country. I got hooked on it. When it came time to go back to school, I sent them a letter that said, how can I go back and study history when we're busy making it, which was kind of arrogant. Undergraduate letter. It was also true. It was also And so I went back home to Bakersfield, where I grew up, and Cesar Chavez had just started a grape strike with migrant farm workers, mostly from Mexico. And I'd grown up in the middle of that world. I'd never seen it. I had to go to Mississippi, get what we call Mississippi Eyes, to go back home, see another community of people of color, also without political rights, also without economic protections, and California with its own history of racial discrimination, segregation, going back to the Chinese at the turn of the century. So it turned out that Mississippi was not an exception to America. It was an example of the America we needed to change. And that led to the next 16 years of work with the farm workers, another 10 years of union issue electoral work, mostly in California, when finally I reached a point where I felt I'm stuck. And that's when I got invited to my 25th reunion at Harvard. I don't know why. I still hadn't graduated. I still had a year to go. I was a dropout, but there was another dropout up in Seattle who did pretty well with a little company he started, but that wasn't me. But I went to this reunion, and it was like running into a 20-year-old version of me. And 20-year-old me said, how's it going? I said, I don't know. I'm feeling kind of stuck. He said, well, why don't you come back and finish that senior year? You never did. I said, I don't know if my brain will still work. I don't know. So I went to see one of the deans the last day. He turned out to be an Episcopal priest. We talked for 3 hours. We figured out tuition had changed a little bit in the intervening period of time. It was a problem. But I wound up in 1961, wound up going back in 1991 and writing a senior thesis in history and government, graduating class of 64-92. And my 81-year-old mother got to come, that you saw the picture, my 81-year-old mother got to come and see her son finally become a college graduate, so was able to kind of close that particular loop. But I got hooked, and so then went on to the Kennedy School for a master's and a PhD in sociology. And while I was working on the PhD, I was asked to design a course on organizing, which was a great gift to me because it was a way to integrate my life experience in social science in a conversation with a rising generation. What a gift to be able to go to class twice a week and have a conversation with the future. What a gift. What a gift for young learning. That's how you meet people like Farhan. That's how you meet the greatest joy of a teacher is to begin to learn from their students. which is what I've been doing with Farhan in his work that he's developing. And so that discovery, so when I finished the PhD, I've been on the faculty then full-time there, teaching organizing, public narrative, distance learning version of organizing for the last 5 years. And that's sort of where a lot of the work that I've been doing for the last few years is rooted in this generation of organizers and young people who are trying to create change, and in a set of tools that we developed through which to create that change. And I want to take just a few moments then to spell out what those tools are. The first, and this is interesting because these tools that I'm going to describe, everybody in this room is hardwired to do them. When we teach people organizing and collective action and leadership, it's much more about taking something people do implicitly and making it explicit so they can become skillful practitioners bringing craft to their work. And the first one of these is relationship building. Now, everybody builds relationships, but relationship building turns out to be the fundamental skill or craft when it comes to organizing, to building community power with intentionality. Because it's not just putting a bunch of individuals together, it's bringing people into relationship with each other that begins to make a whole that's greater than its parts. Because in that way, people can begin to learn together, grow together, discover common resources together, challenge each other together, and create the power that they need together. So one of the big differences between organizing and mobilizing, because there's a lot of mobilizing these days of let's click all our mice at a certain time on the internet, or let's all go to a rally and then everybody fades away. It's all about individuals. Organizing's about relationship. It's about building community. And the power that is in that to create new sources of community and capacity. And you can get to scale. I mean, relationship building is basically the foundation we built for Nancy Pelosi's first and only contested election in 1987. Individuals inviting friends to their homes, and then they invite other friends, sort of like Tupperware, and make a chain, and it adds up. In that campaign, it was 81 House meetings. We built an organization that elected her in a 6-week campaign. Or Barack Obama's election in South Carolina, based on 150 House meetings in 2007. So relationship building, it sounds so trivial, and it is anything but trivial because it's fundamental to the whole approach. The second basic skill or practice here is a skill of the heart. Learning how to translate our values into the emotional resources that enable us to respond to challenges with courage as opposed to reacting with fear. That's the work we do through public narrative. Narrative, storytelling, is one way we've learned to access our values for the emotional resources we need to respond with courage rather than react. Stories. And everybody tells stories, and everybody's heard stories, and every culture tells stories. Stories through which we can identify with protagonists who choose action inspired by sources of hope and solidarity and self-worth located in their values are how we learn to do that. And because values are emotional in content, they serve us not only as sources of information about what we ought to do, but as sources of the motivation to actually do it. As St. Augustine wrote, it's one thing to know the good, it is another to love it. Loving it is what enables action upon it. By learning to tell stories of the sources of our own calling, our stories of self, stories of our own sources of hurt, as well as our own sources of hope, we can teach others, and we can enable others to get us. By attending to the stories of others, we can experience the values we share. And by recognizing this moment as one that requires action of us, a story of now, we can inspire action. The art of public narrative, the craft of public narrative, was one of the basic skills in which we trained organizers in the Obama campaign. People came thinking they're going to learn Obama's story. We said, no, you're going to learn to tell your own story, because that is what enables you to engage with other people and together create a shared story that is going to enable you to find the moral resources for courage, for action, for risk-taking, for commitment, and what it takes. Third, Stories are about the heart. Leadership must grapple not only with why things matter, but how to get them done. That's a matter of the head. And that's what strategy is about. Strategy. Learning how to turn what we have, resources, into what we need, power, to get what we want, our goals, our objectives. Dr. Martin Luther King described power as the ability to achieve purpose. And we need to build it if we are to achieve our purpose, and strategy is about how to turn resources into power. It's all about needs and resources. If you need my resources to meet your needs and I need your resources to meet my own, we can make a deal, right? We can cooperate, we can collaborate, we can make a cooperative, we can make a collaborative daycare, we can make a cooperative bank, we can make all kinds of collaboratives, because our mutual interdependency gives us greater capacity to act. But what if you need my resources more than I need yours? Then who's got the power? Let me ask it again. You need my resources more than I need yours. Who's got the power? And if we flip it around, then who's got the power? See, and there's the problem. Because when we have that deficit of power, then I can use your dependency on me to satisfy my interests at your expense. And that's the problem. That's the problem. And so for those who want to create change, the question is, how do we flip that balance? One way we flip the balance is the way they did in Montgomery, Alabama. They discovered that by combining, that bus company needed them more than they needed the bus company, because they could walk to work. Took sacrifice. It's costly, but they won. Another way we learn is that we have to figure out how to compensate for resources we don't have with greater resourcefulness, because the status quo will always have more resources at its disposal. For those who want to change things, there's a need to compensate with resourcefulness. And the reading that we heard at the beginning, the invocation, the story of David and Goliath, or Daud and Galut and the people of Galut. Know that story? I mean, the version of the story that I learned was, the people of Galut and the Bnei Israel were fighting each other. And so they sent their great warrior, Galut, out, and he said, I'm the great warrior, come up and send your champion. And if he beats me, we're yours. And if you beat me, and if I beat him, you're ours. And everybody was afraid nobody would show up. They kept just looking at their shoes or had to clean their rooms or whatever it was. And then one day, a guy named Jesse sent his youngest son, David, who wasn't even a soldier, he was a shepherd, to bring lunch to his brothers, who were soldiers. And David shows up and he's got lunch for his brothers. And Galut comes out. He starts doing his, I guess you could call him yo mamas these days. I mean, he starts shouting what he's shouting. And David's outraged. This is an insult to the ranks of the living God. We can't have this. And his brothers say, shut up, kid. Don't make trouble. He says, no. And so he goes to the king and he says, King Saul, he says, I'll go fight Goliath, Galut. And he says, Saul takes a look at him. He says, well, he's been a warrior since his youth. You're but a youth. You haven't been to, Kennedy school. You don't have the training. And David said, yeah, but I'm what you got. He said, well, you got a point. He says, I'll let you go fight, but on one condition. You got to use my sword, my shield, my shield, my helmet. So David puts them on, but he can't move. They're too heavy. That's when he looks down at his feet and he notices 5 small stones. And he says, wait a second, I'm a shepherd, not a soldier. As a shepherd, I knew how to protect my flock from the wolf and the bear. It wasn't with the sword and the shield, it was with the stone and the sling. Maybe this Galut guy is just another lion, just another bear. He takes off all that armor. He picks up those little stones, puts them in his pouch, goes to face him. And what is Goliath's reaction? Ha, am I a dog? You sent a boy with a stick, and in the middle of the third, stone in the forehead, and that's the end of Goliath. Now, it's not a story about nonviolence, but it is a story. But it is a story about strategy. And the important story about strategy, just think for a moment what the story is. Does strategy start with David sending out to McKinsey for a feasibility study on how to defeat giants? What does it start with? What does it start with? David's outrage. David's anger at injustice. David's commitment is what it begins with. And he decides to act on it, so he goes to the king and he gets a conventional advice. Oh, you want to fight the powerful? Well, you got to have what they have. And he buys it, except he realizes it won't work for him. His moment of insight is when he realizes, no, I got to build something from resources I have, not that he has. And that's when he picks up those stones. And that's when he sees, no, my resources, my strategy, I build it. And he goes to face Goliath. And Cesar Chavez used to say, power makes you stupid. And what he meant was, when you're used to relying on an overwhelming preponderance of military, political, and economic might, you stop thinking. And that's what creates opportunities for the Davids of this world. Resourcefulness as a way to compensate for resources we don't have by building on resources that we do have. To me, that's what strategy is all about. 2 more things, and then we're done. Time on screen to the... Oh, okay. 2 more things. All right. And then we're done. This makes sense about strategy, though, doesn't it? I love that story. I was so glad you started with that at the beginning because it is so profound in its wisdom, as so many of our stories are, our ancient stories, our old stories. They're so rich. Well, we got the heart and we got the head, but then there's the hands, and that's what action is about. That's the 4th craft here. The outcome of an election is decided by counting votes, or in the case of nomination, by delegates. Organizing only becomes real if it can turn commitments of time into the action required to win. Phone calls, house visits, reminder calls, getting people to the polls. These commitments and these actions have to be real in order to work. Measurable, real, and have just as much significance as the votes themselves. And the reason I'm saying this is, see, the big resource challenge is that, as I was saying before, the big resource challenge is that they're always going to have more money. Now, there's a resource that's more widely distributed than money, and that's time. And that's why volunteer effort is about the only way to compensate for money we don't have with the resource we do have. And that means the capacity to effectively organize volunteer effort is critical to any strategy to create change. That's what we did with Obama in 2007 and 8, was translate people's time into effective action. And what I'm talking about here is what it takes to make effective action. It's not just like, oh, just go out there and do your thing. There's a science, believe it or not, to how to pass out leaflets. There's a science about where to stand to give a leaflet. There's a science about how to make a phone call. See, sometimes this work is dismissed as trivial and unimportant. And to dismiss it in that way is to trivialize people's time and resources. People don't commit time, energy, and effort because it's easy. They commit time, energy, and effort because they think it will make a difference, because it's valuable. And so the challenge of organizers is to create opportunities for people to contribute time in such a way that it is valued and valuable. And that means training, and it means focus, and it means counting, and it means accountability, and it means not accountability to just, to police people, but to learn. Oh, this is working. Oh, that's not working. Oh, we can do it better. I came from the School of Organizing that said if you can't count anything, if you can't count, it didn't happen. But the critical thing is what you're counting. And so learning to take that same seriousness and discipline to the volunteer work of any campaign effort is crucial to actually turning it into power. And that depends on mastering the art of getting real commitments from people. The last and 5th practice I want to mention is about structure. Our sustained effectiveness depends on our ability to craft structures, organizational structures of coordination, accountability, and decision-making that enable us to make the most of our collective resources. All too often, however, we have far less experience of dream teams than we do of I want to scream teams. Or is that not so? When our power depends on effective collaboration and collective action, and internally, within our organizations and our efforts to organize ourselves, we don't work that way. We got a problem. We got a big problem. And one of the problems is so designing a structure that enables us to make the most of our leadership, and not the least, is the idea. Now, the old way of doing things was you had one boss who told everybody else what to do. Now, that's fine for that boss, but it wastes a lot of people's capacity and opportunities to own and create and contribute and own pieces of it and be responsible. And it actually doesn't work very well anymore. All over the world, it's being challenged in so many ways. Sometimes we react to that structure so much that we say, okay, we're not going to have anybody in charge here, right? We're all equals. We're all leaders. Well, that has its problems too. There's a feminist sociologist in the 70s, Jo Freeman, wrote a piece about that. She called it the tyranny of structurelessness. She said, anytime people get together, they're going to form a structure. Now, either you do it intentionally and visibly, or it's going to still happen, but everybody's going to say, well, who really decided that? Or, well, wait, why is that person getting to do that? And that, you know what I'm talking about. I mean, maybe it doesn't happen in this community. It just happens in communities I've had some experience in. I mean, maybe this is a big exception, but probably not. No, and so stepping up and owning the responsibility to create structures that work for us are critical. And what we have been learning, especially since the Obama campaign, is how to do that by not the one boss, but not no boss, but like collaborative leadership teams. It's a team structure. And you know, teams are one thing we really know a lot about in the social science, about how to make a team work. It's not a mystery. It takes a clear purpose. It takes clear norms. It takes clear roles. It takes the determination to take ourselves seriously enough to do the work to enable our team to function. That's how we launched the whole volunteer effort with Obama in 2007. It was the first time anybody had done this with it was always been like a precinct leader or something like that, very problematic. Through these teams, we're able to sustain accountability and motivation and interdependently divvy up the work in such a way that it got done. Obama won Ohio in 2008 based on 1,100 local neighborhood teams. Responsibility pushed all the way down, but organized in such a way that people could actually work together to get the work done. And our leadership teams that then each team member builds their own team, and it becomes like a cascade, or some people say like a snowflake, as a different way to structure leadership and organization and engagement. And that's how the Dreamer movement was built. Yeah, I have the Dreamers. We used it in Jabal Nadif in Amman to build a campaign for safe homes. In Serbia, for a disability campaign. In Japan, for environmental. People are hungry to find structure that will work for them, that will enable them to get the work done, but that breaks with that old, but doesn't throw it all out. And that's the key. All of this takes a serious commitment to training, to leadership development, to coaching. Because in the business world, it may be that we look at things and say, the fewer people we can do this with, the better, because people are a cost. But in the organizing world, we look at things and say, how can we do this with the most people possible, because people are our asset. People are our asset. So, I want to conclude with just a little song. I'm not going to sing. In the 4th grade, they told me, would you please just mouth the words? And that was sort of the end of my singing. No, but it's an appropriate, it's something I want to share. It was a song recorded by Judy Collins in the 60s in the context of the civil rights movement, but it seems like an ever appropriate, and it uses the word freedom. And I want to explain that. The civil rights movement never called itself the civil rights movement. It called itself the freedom movement. And freedom was an ample term. It meant not just to have, like, oh, let's get this law. It was about opportunities to live life fully. The opportunity to develop as a full human being, as a full person, in terms of one's own faith, one's own dignity, one's own aspirations. And so if you hear the word in that way, it's a much better way to hear the word than legal rights. That's not what it's really about. And the song goes like this. Freedom doesn't come like a bird on the wing, doesn't fall down like the summer rain. Freedom is a hard-won thing. You have to work for it. You have to fight for it, day and night for it. And every generation has to win it again. Pass it on to your children, brothers. Pass it on to your children, sister. They have to work for it. They have to fight for it day and night for it. And every generation has to win it again. Pass it on to your children. Pass it on. And I'm so grateful to have the opportunity to pass some of it on to people like Farhan and other people in this room, because it's your fight now and it's your turn now, so good luck. Thank you. Thanks very much.